Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. A report released at the United Nations by the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia and Norway into the oil tanker attack that took place on May 12th/13th. That, of course, off the coast of the UAE in the port of Fujairah, has pointed the finger at a likely state actor, saying that this attack would have had to be carried out by a state or by actors who are well versed in intelligence, etc. Now, the report did not itself point the finger directly at the Islamic Republic of Iran. However, we know that U.S. officials such as John Bolton have from the get-go said that Iran was behind those attacks on those 4 oil tankers in Fujairah. Let's discuss the implications of this report going forward. We're now joined by Abdulaziz Alghashian, who is a researcher in Saudi foreign policy at Essex University. He's joining us now from the UK. We're also joined by Hassan Ahmadian, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Tehran. He's joining us now from the Iranian capital. And we're also joined by Issam Laaroussi, who is a professor of international law and is also senior researcher fellow at Trends for Research and Advisory. He's joining us now from Abu Dhabi. Issam, Hassan, and Abdulaziz, thank you all for joining us. Abdulaziz, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this report?
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me, and Eid Mubarak to everybody out there. I think the report, it's very interesting because I think the language that the report was conducted in showed a kind of pragmatic stance that I tried to achieve some kind of balance. A balance between having this very strong pro-Arab, but also more accurately a pro-Gulf, pro-GCC stance vis-a-vis Iran, but at the same time, a kind of language that also indicated some kind of intent to try to de-escalate the situation. I think the differences within the GCC rhetoric or the GCC statements have been also interesting. If you look at, for example, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I think in the United Nations or its ambassador of the United Nations yesterday, I think did mention that it hinted strongly that it was Iran, but while the UAE kind of had a more toned down language, but all indicating towards the likelihood of Iran. And I think the reason for that is that although there's no love lost between the United Arab Emirates and the Islamic Republic of Iran, I think the United Arab Emirates does want to see a kind of de-escalation because it's on its borders, and that's why you have this balancing act. So and now one last thing I would like to say is that the United States entered the picture in a very strong and robust way, and this is a traditional kind of approach that the United States played historically. That they took the lead in these confrontations, which then allowed the other GCC states to take a slight step back and let the United States do the more nitty-gritty work, let's say.
Okay, so Hassan, what do you make of this report? And secondly, as many fingers, or especially the U.S. fingers, pointing at Iran for this attack, I really wonder what benefit would Iran gain in the hypothetical situation that this was carried out by Iran?
Well, thank you first for having me, and Eid Mubarak to all of your audience. I think, the report doesn't indicate really anything with regards to Iran having to do with the attack. But what is puzzling here is the rush that the report came out. They are saying that the investigation is ongoing, but still they are in a rush to come out with something to announce that a state actor is likely behind it. Before them, there was the American rush, of course. You heard John Bolton talking about Iran being most likely behind the attack. and also other Saudi officials. I think what is puzzling is that the tone is down. It's not a very critical statement or any it doesn't provide with any further information about the attack. But still, why was it published is really, we don't know. I think it might be having to do with the differences within the three states doing the investigation, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Belgium. I think these differences are we are seeing these differences in the announcement without indicating Iran, but still there is an insistence that there should be something out. So the report is out, and I think it's as I hear here in Iran, it's a part of the keeping the pressure on Iran high and pressurizing the Iranians. In Iran, of course, there's a sort of a conspiracy rhetoric surrounding the incidents that there are, of course, it might have been used by some to point the fingers at Iran.
But then Hassan, if I may interrupt you for a moment, Hassan, you said that this report seems a bit, but if I were to be fair in this case, Iran also came out quite early on after those attacks and said it was likely Israel, or it was likely sabotage of some sorts to increase or to make relations with its neighbors, such as the UAE, worse. Do you think Iran also rushed its judgment a bit in that case?
I think all have rushed their judgments. I think Iran actually was reacting to early accusations of it. If you follow the Mecca summit and before it, Iran was accused basically by semi-official and even some officials in Saudi Arabia and UAE. So Iran was reacting to those accusations. I think these reactions, basically the rationale here is that Iran doesn't have any interest whatsoever at this point to escalate in its lifeline, the Persian Gulf or the Gulf of Oman. Iran would be suffocating itself by destabilizing this region. So it doesn't have any interest in escalating there. The United States, on the other hand, it has interest. It has indicated that it's the policy of maximum pressure, bringing Iran to its knees, and bringing it begging for a new deal. That's the American rhetoric. But Iran has been so far acting so rationally and inclined not to increase the tension. So this attack comes up all of a sudden, and it's a different thing than from what we have heard from Tehran up until now.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up that point, and I'm going to Issam, tell us the point of view from Abu Dhabi and the UAE. What do you make of this report, and do you think that the UAE is trying to de-escalate the situation?
I think the UAE is still now is not. I think it's not condemning directly Iran for being involved in those attacks against oil tankers in the Gulf last month. But anyway, I think UAE may be waiting to see whether also other intelligence agencies can provide some evidence that Iran directed surrogate groups or possibly Houthi rebels to carry out this attack, which means that the UAE is not very supportive to, I think, to condemn directly Iran for being involved in that operation, that terrorist attack. But anyway, there is some assumptions that, sometimes I think that the diplomacy, the EU diplomacy, is really supportive by the idea, by I think the classical rhetoric that Iran was behind the attacks, and maybe the first author of the attacks, not thinking about other actors or other states as your interrogator, your professor, mentioned that maybe all your question, maybe Israel is behind the operation. But anyway, the EUE is now they have their classical rhetoric that the attacks may be conducted by Iran because to send also a clear message to the U.S. and the Gulf states about its capacity, because Iran wants to maybe to send a clear message to the U.S. or GCC countries about its capacity to wreak havoc in oil, shipping, including through the Strait of Hormuz. This is, I think, the main message that I think previously EUE is canvassed that Iran maybe is the first author of this and the culprit of this operation. And also, Iran is also battling the effect of U.S. sanctions, including on its ability to export oil, the lifeblood, as we know, of its economy. Yeah. So, for me, the initial findings, I think more likely not directly complain or condemn Iran, which are, I think, very, because EU believe that the operation was very complicated and also technically is using a very sophisticated means of very sophisticated techniques. The sophistication of the attacks, I think the report mentioned the sophistications of the attack, but goes nowhere near identifying the culprits. Even Saudi Arabia today also still blaming Tehran, its arch rival, for doing that.
Abdulaziz, I wonder, where do you stand on what benefit this would hold for Iran? Do you think it is, as Issam there, hypothesized, that this would be, if Iran, in the hypothetical situation, did carry out this attack, is this Iran trying to send a message to the Persian Gulf countries and others about its stances through these U.S. sanctions, that it can close the Strait of Hormuz, et cetera, et cetera? Or do you think that this is, as the Iranians would say, listen, this is sabotage, this is a third party, i.e. Israel or otherwise, that is trying to sabotage or make worse relations with neighboring countries such as the UAE? What is your stance on that?
My stance, I mean, there's a lot of issues that I want to respond upon, and it fits well with answering your question. Sure. I think, firstly, this is not, although people might say this is a classical kind of rhetoric, but it's actually a classical situation. This situation, this theme of threatening this Iranian rhetoric since the 80s, of threatening to close the Straits of Hormuz, of trying to stop or hinder the supply of oil, has always been there. So this cycle has never stopped, actually. Now we fast forward. This was and also Iran has actually attacked Saudi oil tankers in the 1980s. So we don't have to dig deep in history to find that out. But more recently, this rhetoric, these attempts came at a time just after the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps naval commander said that, hey, we can shut the Straits of Hormuz and we can affect the effects of the oil supply. Now, this is something that I want to also indicate as well, that Iran, and whoever studies Iran, and my colleague Hassan knows Iran far more than I do, and he seems to be a very pragmatist, but there's also a very complex dimension in Iran. There's these hawks that try to have this very fiery rhetoric towards the United States and fueling this attack, these threats to Iran, to the United States and the oil supplies. This is clearly not pragmatic, but it's ideologically motivated. But you do have the pragmatists there in Iran that say, listen, stop this. There is no interest for us to do this. So this is a result of this, in my opinion, this is a result of a lot of domestic complexities within Iran. But that being said, and I want to give the bottom line here.
Okay.
You're right. It's not in the interest of Iran, but the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commander, and also the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in itself, is built in its in doctrine to have these asymmetric guerrilla warfare tactics, to have these unconventional tactics in the Navy, and they have threatened to stop to stop the supply of oil. And so it's not only in the interest of Iran, not in the interest of Iran to do this, but it's also not in the interest of the United States, because the oil prices are going to skyrocket, are going to go higher. So this is why. So I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's a result of
Abdulaziz, if I may interrupt you just for a moment, do you think, just if I'm guesstimating here, do you think that a third party such as Israel, for example, if I may just throw that into the mix here, do you think that entity would actually benefit the most from escalation of tensions between Iran and, be it Saudi Arabia or the UAE or otherwise?
Okay. This is a very complex issue, I think, because firstly, yes, I think I won't say just Israel, but in this situation, demonizing Iran or making Iran seem the way it is being portrayed is in the benefit of the people that want to see more sanctions upon Iran. This is the general situation, whether it's Israel or whether it's Arab states, whatever it may be. However, in this aspect, I urge cautiousness to the audiences. Why? Because in the rhetoric in the Middle East, Israel is always perceived and used as a demonizing tactic. Whatever there's a situation, there's always a blame on Israel for something that probably Israel didn't do. Now, in my opinion, I don't think we should give Israel, bigger than its share. We make Israel seem like this big human, this big superpower, and it's behind all these conspiracies in the world and so on. Sometimes we just have to take responsibility and call a spade a spade. And then in this situation, I don't see Israel being, although it did benefit from this situation, but it did not benefit directly.
Very well. Let me get Hassan in. Hassan, we have a lot there. I, of course, want to give you the chance to respond. Do you think, Hassan, that it is possible that Iran is trying to, in fact, send a message?
Well, I think if sending a message is important for Tehran, it wouldn't do it in a place of high sensitivity for its own, economy. It has a lot, of other spaces to do that, and I think it has done that, be it in Yemen and other places in the region. The Persian Gulf is sensitive for Iran. It's a place, as I said, it's Iran's economy's lifeline. It can't mess with it. And what Abdulaziz was saying, that Iran has attacked, Saudi tankers during the 80s. Well, that was a war. The Saudis at the 80s, downed Iranian fighter jets and attacked Iranian ships as well. And the United States attacked two Iranian main oil exporting ports in the Persian Gulf. So it was a war. And in war, you don't get sweets, for others attacking. You don't give sweets for others attacking you. So it's a tit for tat situation. It's basically the essence of deterrence. You say that if you attack us, we will attack you. And I think that rhetoric, that tradition of deterrence has been there for 4 decades on the Iranian part. Saying that Iran will be excluded from the Persian Gulf on the part of the United States and some of its allies has triggered this rhetoric and encouraged it in Iran that if we are to be excluded, we will make you suffer as well. So I think that's totally different from what we are seeing here. I personally don't believe, beyond, if we take Iran as a rational actor, which I do, it can't do this at this point because first it will be helping the maximum pressure, campaign on the part of the United States. And second, it will be suffocating itself. So it's beyond rationality. If we take it as an irrational actor, then yes, we can guess whatever. I think strategically, Iran's decisions are not taken by, right or left, as Abdulaziz was mentioning. Strategic decisions are taken on the highest level, the Supreme National Security Council, which has in it all the stakeholders in Iran, left and right, and military, IRGC, whomever. They decide, and then Iran acts. And I think such an act, hypothetically, if carried out by Iran, which I really don't think is the case, it should have been gone through that. And I don't think you can differentiate them between, those hardliners and those, dovish, views in Iran. So basically, I think it goes beyond rationality. That's why I don't believe that Iran, being a rational actor over the course of 4 decades, or at least, in the past, after the JCPOA, it can't be doing such a thing under U.S. maximum pressure campaign.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it at that as our final comment. But of course, we do appreciate all of your insight and, of course, your time and analysis. We'll try to have you all back on to continue this conversation. Certainly a very interesting one and an important one to have. That was Hassan Ahmadian, Issam Laaroussi, and Abdulaziz Alghashian, who are speaking to us there about that report that has come out between the UAE, released, I should say, by the UAE, Norway, and Saudi Arabia into those May 12th attacks at the port of Fujairah on those 4 oil tankers. We'll keep a very close eye on how that develops going forward. But of course, that report did not specifically point fingers at the Islamic Republic of Iran, although, as I said in my introduction as well, and as our guests alluded to also, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, has made his decision, really, saying that Iran was behind that attack. And of course, other U.S. officials, military officials especially, have also said it must have been Iran. What Iranian interests or what would Iran gain from any such attack, of course, is an open question. Again, as our guests had alluded to there, we'll keep a close eye on what happens next now that the United Nations has been presented with this report. How does the investigation move forward? I'll be back after a break with our next segment. Stay tuned. Thank you for staying with us here in Scope, viewers. In this segment, we're going to discuss Xi Jinping's visit to Russia. And this has come at an important time, of course, as both Russia and China are having their differences, of course, with the United States, China specifically in the trade war, and Russia, of course, we can pick up a whole list of disagreements with the U.S., be it collusion in their elections or alleged collusion in their elections, Ukraine or Syria or otherwise. So there's a lot, of course, on the table. There's a lot that binds these two powers together. There's also talk now of moving away from the U.S. dollar when it comes to trade between the two nations. Does that mean that the era of the supremacy of the U.S. dollar is slowly coming to an end, amongst other, of course, agreements that have been signed between these two nations? This, of course, the U.S. must be looking at with worry or not. We'll talk about that now with our guests. We're joined now by Guy Burton, who is an adjunct professor at Vesalius College in Brussels. He teaches international relations. He's joining us now from Brussels itself via Skype. We're also joined by Gilbert Doctorow, who is an independent international affairs analyst with a focus on Russia, and he's published 4 books on that topic as well. He's also joining us from the Belgian capital on the line. And we're joined by Kamran Gasanov, who is a political observer at Zargar TV. He's joining us now from the Russian capital, Moscow. Kamran, Gilbert, and Guy, thank you all for joining us. Guy, I'd like to start with you. What did you make of the meeting between Xi and Putin? And of course, what this means going forward, not just between their alliance, but what this means for the U.S. as well.
Well, I would say that it was quite what we probably expected. I mean, there were a lot of warm words on both sides by President Xi and Putin. Certainly what sort of brought them together is, as you pointed out in your introduction, sort of differences of opinion, different rising tensions between sort of the Americans and the Chinese on one side and the Americans and the Russians on the other. But I think it's also important to bear in mind that this is we should look at this beyond merely the sort of the proximate immediate causes and think about this in a more sort of structural way as well. The way that the international system seems to be operating is that we're moving away from a unipolar world into one that's more multipolar. So, sort of the dominance of the United States is reducing, although that should be emphasized that it's a relative of influence. But then when you compare it, it's actually the Chinese who are probably the more significant power out of the two. Chinese are increasingly becoming closer to the United States, at least in economic terms, if not yet geopolitically and militarily. I mean, the possibility of sort of China and the United States being sort of on a level playing field is still probably a few decades away. So, of course, the United States is resisting that. On the other hand, you have Russia, which is a country that's coming back, as it were. If you think about the decline of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, what we've really seen in the last decade and a half under Putin is the rise of Russia, or sort of the search for great power status again. So Russia is not necessarily on sort of near peer level as China is. So it's quite interesting, I think, to sort of factor that in, that we're not looking at the Russians and the Chinese on a completely level playing field. And it's also really striking that their sort of warm words, that their growing relationship is really sort of one that is a response to their position towards the United States.
Okay. Gilbert, what do you make of that? I think that, as Guy there said, this is genuinely a sign that this unipolar world mindset that the U.S. may have, that facade is really being shattered.
I will jump in now. I have to tell you frankly, this telecommunications line is not very good, and so I will respond more directly to what your previous speaker said, which I heard perfectly, than to the question which you may have just posed, which I only heard partially. I disagree substantially with the perspective that I just heard. This question of relations between Russia and China is not exactly a new one. I mean, they're rapprochement, they're finding common points. I was just going through materials from 1997, and as I prepare to write a book on the 1990s, the roaring 1990s in Moscow, the expatriate community. And I found a very interesting Financial Times article. It was one of the first meetings that President Yeltsin had in 1997 when he came back to office after having had this quadruple heart bypass and having been out of action for almost 7 months for illnesses. One of his first meetings was precisely with the Chinese. And it was remarked at the time, yes, it looks like the Chinese and the Russians are going to be coming together, and perhaps they will achieve $8 billion in mutual trade and perhaps $20 billion in the year 2000. So this type of interest in the relations between the Chinese and the Russians has been going on for quite some while. It has been their common interests have been accelerated enormously by the very peculiar and ill-considered policy of the United States to go after both of them at the same time and to undo entirely. This didn't happen under Trump. It happened under Obama. That virtually all that Henry Kissinger and Nixon had achieved in 1971 was undone by the first two presidential administrations in the 21st century. Between George Bush and Obama, they virtually unstuck any of the residual closeness between the United States and the Chinese at the expense of the Russians. And indeed, they forced the Russians and the Chinese into one another's arms. Now, this is not an alliance. Neither country, neither Russia nor China, is interested in alliances. They're interested in entente, in coordinating policy. And just to look at only what happened in the last few days in the public eye is to miss entirely what the nature of their meeting was about. We also know that both Xi and President Putin were in meetings that went on late into the night, into the early morning, each day out of these 3 days that they've been together. Yeah. And they weren't talking about the weather. They were talking certainly about how to coordinate the good cop, bad cop approach, who's going to be easy on the United States, who's going to be tough and frank about the United States. And they have a very well-coordinated policy of how to handle the international tensions.
Okay,
Now,
so if you allow me, Gilbert, I wanted to get Kamran in on this conversation. Kamran, what are your thoughts and what is your view there from Moscow itself? What exactly has President Putin been able to achieve by having President Xi, in the country in this fashion, and of course having him attend, that summit there?
I think this is one step more in moving Russian-Chinese relations to the relations of strategic partners. Actually, I wouldn't say that China is an ally for Russia, but in the current geopolitical terms, it's important to be united, to stay together, because I would mention two reasons which move Russia and China together. First of all, you mentioned in the beginning of our program that it is the attitude of the United States. The new American president behaves like a hooligan. He wants to break all rules, break all weapons treaties, confront and resist free trade and free market. And in these terms, Russia and China start to defend this system, this liberal system, which was always protected by USA. And the second term, it concerns the European Union. After the Ukrainian crisis, Russia understood that EU cannot be named like a reliable partner, and Russia depends on EU on gas relations with the European Union, not less than EU depends on Russia. And in this system, Russia needs to find an alternative. And China, with its growing economy, seems to be a good partner and a reliable partner. And now we see that the trade is growing. Last year, we achieved 108 billion euros annually. It's a record count, and we develop our LNG projects, Arctic LNG and Yamal LNG, and Chinese investing. And also we see these close relations also in personal relations. I should mention that Xi Jinping is only one foreign president with whom Putin celebrated his birthday. And also China presented 2 days ago Panda. It's called Panda diplomacy, and it shows also, like in China, everything is symbols. It's important. It's
Indeed. Yeah, so let me bring Guy in on this. Guy, I wanted to allow you to respond to Gilbert there, because he took issue with a few of the things you said. But I wanted to add this on as well, Guy. If we're looking at just purely in economic terms, so if we're talking about increasing trade between these two nations, and then secondly, this decision to move away from the US dollar, should that worry the United States?
Yeah, if I could just respond to Gilbert,
sure.
Doctorow, that would be really helpful. Thank you. I wanted to just mention that I'm not quite sure that I see us as completely unaligned in this respect. So I think he's right to say that certainly there was a movement from around 1997 onwards for Russia and China to start to interact more together. And certainly that reflects a change from the Russian position, which prior to 1996 had been much more pro-Western. Obviously, we're talking about a period in which Russia's position in the world was much weaker than it is today. But that said, I think this rapprochement between Russia and China really only started to become more significant in the last 10 to 15 years. If we think about sort of China's rise, it's really been sort of very prominent after the year 2000. And obviously we've seen the creation or the establishment of organizations like the BRICS, the Russia, India, China, and South Africa organization, which actually Russia was very prominent in trying to make that a reality. So certainly there has been an interest on the side of Russia to engage with China more. So I don't see a difference between that. But what I would say is that the nature of the structure of the international system and the nature of relations between the different countries is such that China is, or rather Russia is, more of a junior partner to the Chinese in this respect. And this comes on to the point that you asked about the economy. I think, if we look at that, the Russian position is to develop trade, to develop an economic relationship with China that is more than it was in the past. But certainly, sort of the Chinese have, a prominence in the global economic system. For Russia, it's not as great, and so certainly it's much more attractive to be able to do so. Now, yes, there has been efforts for the two countries to interact and collaborate on trade that doesn't require the dollar, and they did set up a currency exchange in 2014. But they've been finding that very difficult to get up and running. And part of the reason for that is because the dollar is so omnipresent on the international stage. It's one of the currencies in the world that has the least volatility, and so therefore it's much more attractive for trading partners to use. So we're going to find that difficult to get over in order for Russia and China to be able to operate and to trade without recourse to an international system which the Americans are still preeminent in.
Okay, and then Gilbert, I'll give you the final word. Do you think that when it comes to political events throughout the world, where China and Russia would agree, be it Venezuela, be it Syria, or otherwise, or even the Iran nuclear deal, for example, do you think that has the potential then to derail a lot of American policies around the world?
Well, I think the potential for Russia-Chinese cooperation in geopolitical dimension is far greater than anybody has given it credit for to date, precisely because there's been an underestimation of Russia's significance as a power. The United States, long going back to the 1990s, believed that Russia was a terminally declining power. The reality I see is quite different. The Russia today is a much stronger power than the Soviet Union was, because it has shed the colonial empire that it had, which cost it a vast fortune each year. So Russia today is, as an economic and military presence and as diplomatic presence globally, a very equal partner to China. And that is something that's very underappreciated. It's customary to speak about the Russians as a junior partner in a relationship, and therefore to see a limit on how far it can go. I differ with that. I think it can go extremely far, and we're just at the beginning, precisely because the two partners are much more closely balanced in what they give to each other and complement each other than is generally seen. Just as it used to be thought that Germany and France were an unlikely marriage because one was so much more powerful than the other. But the reality in geopolitics was that France gave Germany vast advantage that it didn't have in the diplomatic scene, precisely because it hadn't been the defeated, aggressive country that Germany had been. So it is with Russia and China today. They are well matched. They serve one another's interests in a variety of ways. Russia is now became a year ago the single biggest supplier of petroleum to China, precisely because it agreed to do trade in yuan, which Saudi Arabia did not do. So there's another issue that we just touched on. Where does the currency fit in? It fits in. It'll take a long time before the dollar is displaced. Certainly not in the next few years, but directionally it's clear. There's going to be more and more trade on national currencies without bypassing the dollar. However,
just because I've just bought myself a few minutes more, just about a minute and a half, Gilbert. I do for interrupting you. I wanted to give Kamran the final word. Kamran, what are your thoughts about the effect that Russia-China cooperation around the world will have on politics globally?
I think this is one of the pillars of multipolar system, and we see that the unipolar system isn't fact actually, and Russia and China should cooperate more. I think now China actually is shy because it has problems. It has trade war with the United States, and also I know that the Chinese companies are not willing now to invest more in Russian economy because they fear that the United States will impose more sanctions and it's not dangerous. But this cooperation is moving forward, and also you mentioned the trade in national currencies. It is one of the most important things because the domination of dollar is one of the pillars of the United States dominance.
Indeed.
Now, I think in long terms, it will be it will happen. But now we see only it's growing very slowly. Only 2 or 3% of Russia-Chinese trade is made in yuan and rubles. And on the Petersburg Forum, I heard from my internal resources that 3 Russian biggest banks, they refused to make deal in yuan. And it shows that not only China, also Russian companies, Russian business fearing the sanctions from the United States.
Okay, we'll leave there as a final word, but we appreciate all of your time and, of course, spirit insight. That was Kamran speaking to us there from Moscow. We were also joined by Gilbert and Guy, both joining us from the Belgian capital, Brussels. Of course, viewers, as we discussed in this conversation, the Russia-China cooperation, it's probably more accurate to call it cooperation instead of necessarily an alliance, has been one which has been long-standing. It's certainly not a new thing, as Gilbert and Guy both agreed there, since '97 at the very least. Their relations have gotten closer, in part, of course, because of U.S. pressure on them, but otherwise as well because a lot of their policies around the world seem to align when in areas such as, if we're speaking about contemporary times, be it Venezuela, Syria, or the Iran nuclear deal, for example. And then obviously this talk about moving away from the US dollar, that's an important conversation that's happening. It's, again, not a new conversation, but it's one that seems to be picking up steam at this point. It will not have necessarily a short-term immediate effect on the global economy necessarily, but long-term, it may very well mean that the dominance of the US dollar will end. We'll keep a very close eye on what this cooperation between these two huge powers, really, and important powers in global politics and the economy means going forward. I'll be back, though, after a short break with our next segment. Welcome back, viewers. In this segment, we're going to discuss the latest developments in Sudan. We know that the African Union, for example, has suspended Sudan's membership after at least 100 protesters. Of course, many estimates say upwards of 250 even have been killed in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum. This, of course, by the RSF, which is the Rapid Support Forces government militia, who have been blamed for that massacre. We also know that that Ethiopia has gotten involved now in trying to mediate between the opposition, or I should say the protesters, and the civilian council, as well as the military council. Will that be successful? To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Dr. Sidgi Kaballo, who is a Sudanese political activist. He's joining us now from the British capital, London, via Skype. Dr. Kaballo, thank you for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of that massacre that took place in the Sudanese capital? Why do you think it is that the RSF acted the way it did?
Well, it is a struggle between the people who want a real change of the old system of Bashir and the TMC, that is the Transitional Military Council, which wants to inherit the regime. They want only the change of Bashir and his junta while the regime continues as it is. And that is why they don't want to give control to the leadership of the Sudanese revolution, which is the forces of change and freedom. The forces of change and freedom have a declaration to make change in the civil service, in the legislations, and in the economy that uproot the old system and bring a real democratic system which allows for peace and democracy in the Sudan. The MTC, the TMC, is using the rapid forces for two reasons: that they are able of doing such a sort of massacre. Their history is of massacres in Darfur and Nuba Mountains. At the same time, to get rid of them in the future. So I think they are standing behind the massacre, the TMC, allowing these forces to suppress, to do the dirty work for them.
So then, Dr. Kaballo, I wonder who exactly, as an external party, do you think should be involved in this case in trying to mediate or trying to resolve the situation towards democracy? Do you think it should be the African Union or Ethiopia, as the Prime Minister there is now involved?
Well, mediation in this matter will not lead if it does not adopt the agenda of the forces of change and freedom. Because the people in the Sudan are insisting on change. They paid a lot for that. There is a lot of blood since the 19th of December. There are many people died until now. So they will not accept a compromise which allow the old regime to exist. They learned from their experiences in 1964 and 1985 that without a real change, they only repeating the mistake of civilian military interchange.
So, Dr. Kaballo, if I may come in, I do apologize. I apologize for interrupting you. I'm wondering, though, it can be argued that Omar al-Bashir led through fear. And from the reports, at least that I have seen, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that since this massacre took place in Khartoum, many people have been staying home out of fear that there would be more massacres. Do you think that the military council will be successful in again, using fear as a weapon against the people of Sudan?
People are staying home not just out of fear, because they accepted the call for civil disobedience and general strike. Today, the first day to return to work will prove that the people are insisting of staying at home, not working until the TMC goes and the civilian government will be established to continue the transitional period.
Dr. Kaballo, I wonder if you're looking at other countries in North Africa where there have been revolutions. So I can use the example of Egypt or even Algeria, really. Do you think that Sudan will be an example for those countries? Because we know in Egypt, for example, we now have Sisi in power, who is again a military man. Secondly, in Algeria as well, Ben Salah is in power, who essentially was a Bouteflika, ally. Do you think Sudan will be different, though?
Sudan will be different for two reasons. One is that Sudan has, despite that the military has ruled Sudan for almost 22 years before Bashir, and 30 years now, has democratic forces and democratic experience and a history of revolution against the military in peaceful way. This didn't happen in other countries. The democratic forces are stronger, are more organized in the Sudan. And the military themselves, despite this TMC, are different in the Sudan.
Okay.
The army, in the two past experiences, stood with the people. So the TMC now, in reality, is doing something against the people and against the wish of the army itself, the young soldiers and officers.
Okay. All right, so Dr. Kaballo, we'll have to leave it there at that. Unfortunately, has gotten the best of us, sir, but of course we appreciate your time this morning there speaking to us from the British capital. We were joined there by Dr. Sidgi Kaballo, who is a Sudanese political activist. Now, as Dr. Kaballo there mentioned, viewers, the situation in Sudan can be argued to be different. Of course, we'll have to wait and see how this plays out. Is it really that much more different than Egypt or Algeria? Certainly, so far, the signs do indicate that it is, but we'll have to, again, like I said, see how this plays out and how the external players' influence will work out as well. The African Union at this time, as I said in my introduction, has suspended Sudan. The Ethiopian Prime Minister is at this time involved in trying to mediate. Seemingly, he is respected by both sides, but we'll have to, again, wait and see how that process works itself out as well. Obviously, a lot of blood has been shed, as Dr. Kaballo there correctly mentioned. People are staying home, not just, as many media are saying, out of fear, but also because of the general strike. And that's, of course, an important clarification to make, that this is also a pressure tactic on the part of the people towards the TMC, that is the Transitional Military Council. We'll keep a very close eye on all those developments there in the Sudan here in Scope, but I'll leave it there for now. For this edition, I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thank you very much for watching.